What is the source of ethical norms, or what is the source of normative ethics? The normative ethics can be divided into three categories based on the question, what are the norms, or how do I arrive at the conclusion that stealing is wrong? Number one, through reason. We have already looked at Immanuel Kant and his theory of categorical imperative. In Christian ethics, there is a very famous theory. It's known as natural law ethics. It was espoused by Thomas Aquinas and is a very good example of rational ethics, or arriving at normative ethics through reason. Natural law ethics has three basic aspects. Number one, the goal of everything in the nature is built into the thing itself, and therefore by observing the object in the nature we can discern that for what purpose that thing was created and placed in the nature. Number two, built in the structure of the thing are the set of laws that govern the conduct of the object. These set of laws are essentially connected with the goal for which it has been created and placed, and therefore these rules of conduct can be known universally by reason apart from the revelation. Number three, natural law theory claims that what order we can discover about the object by observing it in the nature. It is consistent with what man intuitively knows through his conscience. In other words, by observation what we know about the object and what we intuitively knows in itself are consistent with each other. And therefore, in other words, these ethical laws are embedded in our conscience also. Number two is through prescription. This position holds that law of ethics are prescribed by an authority who mandates them. For Christians, the authority figure is God, and therefore Christian ethics is known as divine command theory ethics. But there is a critique, and this critique is known as EUTHRYPHO dilemma, posited by Plato long back. He asked the question whether an act is right because God wills it, or whether God wills it because he already knows that the act is right. Let me rephrase it again. Whether an act is right because God wills it, or whether God wills it because he already knows that the act is right. Let's take an example to explain this dilemma. Stealing is wrong. If I say an act is right because God wills it, then the ethics becomes arbitrary. Because if God chooses to say that stealing is right, then the act of stealing becomes right. But if I say God wills that stealing is wrong, then it would mean that there is a standard that God is using in order to say that act is wrong, and therefore the question will arise, what is the moral standard which is above God? So in order to answer this dilemma, I think the answer lies in the second statement, that God wills an act to be wrong or right because he already knows whether it is right or wrong. But he is not using a moral law which is above him, but he is using the moral law which is inbuilt in him, or this law is in himself. The ethics is based on the perfect nature of God, because God is morally perfect, and therefore all ethical statements that God makes is based on his morally perfect, unchanging nature. The third source of ethical norms is relation. The ethics find its source either in the sense of excitement or gratitude one feels as a result of relationship with a person or a group of persons, like God or fellow human beings. For example, Karl Barth said, we must obey whatever God says when he encounters it. That means in relationship with God, ethics is regulated. Or by how principles relate to a given situation. Joseph Fletcher espoused a theory called Situationism. According to Situationism, ethics is to identify the most loving thing to be done in a given situation. There are two other forms of Situationism which believes that there is only one form of universal principle. So, number first was Situationism of Joseph Fletcher. Number two is Contextual ethics of Richard Niebhur. Niebhur argued that God is in action in this world, creating, governing and redeeming it. And therefore, the right duty is to do action which is appropriate to the activity of God in the given situation. According to Niebhur, responsibility proceeds in every moment of decision and choice by inquiring what is going on or what is God doing in this situation. Niebhur further analyzes this responsibility as including four components. Number one, response itself to an action upon us. Number two, interpretation of the action upon us. Number three, accountability or anticipation of answers to our questions. And four, social solidarity. For Niebhur, the universal principle of action was justice. Third is Koinonia ethics. According to Paul Lehmann, the Koinonia is the power of Christ present in the world, enabling the creation of fellowship. And therefore, responsibility of the person is to discern what God is doing in the world by way of raising the quality of life and enlarging the human prospect. In this task, the Christian turns not to principles or precepts, but to an analysis of relations and functions. There are three schools of ethical thinking. Number one is virtue ethics. Number two is deontological ethics. Number three is teleological ethics. Virtue ethics. Number one. Virtue ethics theory is associated with Greek philosopher Aristotle, who uses the term virtue to express our moral obligations. Virtue may be defined as any disposition of character or personality that an individual desires in him or others. According to Aristotle, virtues are middle ground between deficiency and excesses. The theory emphasizes that character development is more important than presenting moral principles that guide actions. The core of Aristotle's account of moral virtue is his doctrine of golden mean. Let me explain virtue ethics a little bit more further. Being happy, according to Aristotle, is like being well fed. How much food should a man eat in order to be well fed? To Aristotle, there is no general answer to this question in the sense of specific amount. It depends on the size of man, what sort of work he does, whether he is ill or well, and so on and so forth. The proper amount for anyone to eat can be ascertained by trial and error. If we eat a certain amount of food and still feel hungry, we should eat more. If we eat the same amount and feel uncomfortable, then we should eat less. The correct amount is mean between eating too much and too little. Plato highlights four virtues in particular, which were later called cardinal virtues. They are wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Other important virtues are fortitude, generosity, good self-respect, good temper, and sincerity. In addition to advocating good habits of character, virtue theorists hold that we should avoid acquiring bad character traits such as cowardice, insensibility, injustice, and vanity. Number two is deontological ethics. Deontological ethics comes from the Greek word deon, which means duty. This is defined as an act is right because it is one's duty. For example, stealing is wrong because the rule says stealing is wrong, and therefore a person should not steal. The two examples of deontological ethics we have already seen. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperatives, and Thomas Aquinas's natural law theory. A good example that I want to give to you now of deontological ethics is W.D. Ross, who propounded a theory called prima facie duties. In this theory, Ross lists moral duties which reflect human beings' moral convictions. He gives 7 moral duties which are cardinal duties. Number 1 is fidelity, the duty to keep promises. Number 2, reparation, the duty to compensate others when we harm them. Number 3 is gratitude, the duty to thank those who help us. Number 4, justice, the duty to recognize merit. Number 5, beneficence, the duty to improve the conditions of others. Number 6, self-improvement, the duty to improve our virtue and intelligence. Number 7, non-malfeasance, the duty not to injure others. Following are the 3 models of deontological ethics that are evident in church history. Number 1 is legalist model. Basically, all religious groups follow legalist model. They clearly define what is accepted and what is not accepted according to their belief system. Number 2 that we have already seen, natural law model of Thomas Aquinas. But right now there is a critique of the model is in place, a critique of natural law model of Thomas Aquinas. It is often stated that the model developed by Aquinas was in a completely Christianized world. But as the European countries started to colonize the world, they came upon tribes where the practices that were deemed good was diametrically opposite of natural law theory's definition of good, like Karen community, who were notorious headhunters. So question arose how natural law theory will explain such practices which were born indigenously. Number 3rd model is principle model. Principle model states that the extremes of deontological and teleological ethics can be avoided by laying down principles which are consistent with Christian faith and which provides guidelines for human behavior and conduct. Number 3 is teleological ethics. The word teleology comes from the Greek word telos, which means end, aim or goal. And therefore, in contrast to duty ethics, which is known as deontology, teleological ethics emphasizes the consequence of a moral action or the end result of a moral action. If an action produces good and not evil, then it is morally good. If it produces evil, then the action is evil and is wrong. That means consequence determines the rightness or wrongness of the action. There are at least 3 forms of teleological ethics. Number 1 is known as ethical egoism. An action is morally right if the consequences of that action are more favorable than unfavorable only to the person performing the action. Number 2 is ethical altruism. An action is morally right if the consequences of that action is more favorable than non-favorable to everyone except the person who is performing the act. Number 3 is utilitarianism. An action is morally right if the consequences of that action is more favorable than unfavorable for everyone. There are 2 kinds of utilitarianism. Number 1 is known as act utilitarianism. It was proposed by Jeremy Bentham. An action is morally right if under the given circumstance, the action produces the most utility or the most favorable consequences. The problem with Bentham was it was very situational because every action had to be analyzed in a given situation, whether it is producing maximally good or not. Therefore came the second type of utilitarianism, which is known as rule utilitarianism. This theory was proposed by John Stuart Mill. According to Mill, a behavioral code or rule is morally right if the consequence of adopting that rule is more favorable than unfavorable to everyone. So let me differentiate between deontological ethics and teleological ethics. Deontological ethics rule determines the result, while in teleology, result determines the rule. In deontology, rule is the basis of the act, while in teleology, result is the basis of the act. In deontology, rule is good regardless of the result, but in teleological ethics, rule is good because of the result. In deontology, result is always calculated within the rules, while in teleology, result is sometimes used to break the rules.